Like all good Kiwis, I'd gone on my OE and I had this job for a while working for a travel company escorting tourists around Europe on bus tours. I really loved that work. I got to travel and meet lots of new people. But after a while it got a bit repetitive, and so eventually I took a transfer and started working for the company in Africa doing safaris. I loved it there. It moved my soul. I felt like I shed so much baggage from my life that I didn't need, and I just felt I fitted there. While I was there, I had a couple of long-term relationships, and Tanzania is where my son was born. I lived in this tiny village with my son. The other villagers, they called me Wazungu. In their own way, they looked out for me, and I felt connected, like I fitted. 4 years after my son was born, I met an Englishman who'd come over to work putting up power lines, as there was hardly any electricity in the country. His job meant he had to move quite a lot, and I decided I loved him, so I gave up my home and my job to be with him. We'd been together for about 2 years when I got a phone call from a good friend of mine from the town where I used to live, saying that the guy that I'd been going out with previously had died. He'd died from salmonella, typhoid, and he also had AIDS, and she suggested I should probably go and get myself tested. I had the test done on a Friday, and they told me to come back on the Monday for the results. I went back on the Monday, and much to my surprise, they said, "You'll have to have some counselling before we can give you your results," which was pretty proactive, I thought, to be honest. The counselling was on the 7th floor and the lift wasn't working. That walk up all those stairs was like a death walk, like the Green Mile walk. Every step was like, you know when as kids you'd pull the petals off the flowers, he loves me not. It was like that. I've got AIDS, I haven't got AIDS. I've got AIDS, I haven't got AIDS. And it was called AIDS in those days. They didn't call it HIV. The laboratory man walked with me and he didn't say anything at all. So I made up all sorts of stories about that. It was like a dark angel on one shoulder and the devil on the other having a conversation. One would say, "He's not talking because he's not allowed to give anything away." And then the other would answer, "No, he knows and he doesn't want to be the one to tell you." Or they wouldn't take me to counselling if it was negative. If you want to know how that long silent walk felt, it's like if you've ever been alone in your house at night time and you thought someone was trying to break in, or if you're walking down a dark alley at night and you think someone's following you and your heart starts to pound and your head is throbbing and all the adrenaline is rushing, well, that's how it felt. After 7 flights of stairs, I was exhausted, not from the walking but from the emotional turmoil that was going on, just holding that question, and I was absolutely petrified, because in 1990 in Africa, AIDS was a death sentence. We got to the top of the stairs and I was led into this room, a little square room. In the room there was a little wooden table and 2 plastic chairs. Other than that, the room was bare. In one of those chairs was sitting a little Dutch nun in a white habit, and in her very broad accent she started to tell me about AIDS. She took me over to the wall, and there was a poster on the wall. It was a hand-drawn poster of an African man with his shirt off. He was very buff and handsome looking, and there were 4 pictures of the same man. In each of the pictures he was getting skinnier and skinnier, and it was clear he was getting sicker. The last picture was of a hole in the ground with a cross saying R.I.P. She said, "This is what happens to you when you get AIDS. You get skinnier and skinnier and then you die." Then she stopped. She hadn't told me yet, so I said, "Have I got it?" And she said, "Yes, I'm sorry to tell you that you have." So then I said, "So what do I do?" And she said, 3 things. Eat well, rest a lot, and don't have sex. That was her advice. I said, "Well, how long do you think I have?" Because in those days it was a death sentence. You didn't think about not dying, and by that time I'd already had it for 2 years, which was the last time I'd been with my ex-partner. She said, "You'll probably be lucky if you have 3 years. 5 years in total." I remember that day so well. My son was sitting on the floor and he'd just come home from school. He was 6 years old, and I remember looking at him and thinking, I'm not going to see you be 10. I'm not going to see what you will do with your life, what career you might have, and I'm not going to meet your partner. So I had to go home and tell my partner, and he said, "Right, we don't tell anybody. They're just going to think I'm gay and you're a hooker, or we're both drug addicts or something." So it wasn't so difficult not to tell, because the stigma was so great then. That first night I remember trying to go to sleep, but I'd wake up every 5 to 10 minutes with a jolt, sitting bolt upright in bed. And my partner said, "You're no different today than you were yesterday." But I said, "I am. Yesterday I had the possibility of a lifetime, and today I have 3 years of unlucky." So we did keep it quiet and continued on working, which we did for a couple of years, even though I wasn't that well. I got skinnier and skinnier, just like the pictures, and I thought, okay, here it goes. But in hindsight, I can see now at the time I had gone into a dark depression. that came from staying silent, mainly from the isolation and not having anyone to talk to, of not knowing what to do, not having anyone to talk to about it. I was coming up to my 5th year, and even though I didn't feel like I was going to die, I thought I'd better come back to New Zealand because my son needs to have some family support. In New Zealand, the HIV antiretroviral medications had just come out, so I started on those. At first I was living from month to month, and then slowly I began living from year to year. I told my son when he was 14. He had started to ask questions. He'd seen my meds and was asking what they were. I'd say vitamin pills, and he'd say, "Can I have one?" And I'd say, "No, they're women's vitamins." Every now and again I'd have a meltdown and be really upset and need to have a cry, and that alarmed him. So then I told him so that he could understand. It was also the right time, because I could say to him, "Well, I've had it for 8 years, I've had it all this time, and I've been well, so you don't have to worry." And he took it. I asked him not to tell, which I knew placed a huge burden on him all through his teenage years. On the one hand, it was for his own safety, but on the other hand, I knew I had dumped him with the burden of the secret as well. So when I finally asked my son what he'd think if I came out about being positive, his response was, "Well, that would be a relief." I saw my son graduate from university. He got married when he was 21, and I was there for his wedding. I met his partner, and now I'm a grandmother. The medications have just got better and better, and it's been 24 years now. I think there's no way I'm going to die from this. So it's strange to think that 24 years ago AIDS was a death sentence, whereas now it's called HIV. It's not even the same name. HIV has now been reclassified to a chronic manageable illness that someone can live with all their life. I came out on World AIDS Day 2004, and although it was scary, after a while it was just freeing. I see the young ones who've just been diagnosed, and I can see the fear and the concern about confidentiality and the secrecy and all of that stuff, and I think I'm so glad not to be there anymore. But it's gut-wrenching when you see others go through the depths of despair, just trying to cope with the fear while not telling. Getting a disease or a diagnosis like HIV is really life-altering, and you have to go through a grief process because you've lost your identity. You're a totally different person. You have to grieve for the loss of your freedom, for the loss of being carefree, for the irresponsibility of life, because all of a sudden you have to become the exact opposite of these feelings. You have to become responsible and not so carefree, and like all grief processes, you can't fast-track that.